friends. I'm Karen, and this is the Family Food for Moms podcast. We're talking about inspiration for family cooking and dining. Today, I want to talk about an unusual topic: what can inspire us from Famous Five and Enid Blyton Adventure Books, the food parts, the meals they ate. I have mentioned this briefly before in literature, children's literature, and how we can be inspired by what they ate. But I've always been particularly fascinated by the food in the Enid Blyton books, the way they have the meals, what they eat, and I wanted to talk a bit more about that. So these were published starting from about 1946, so after the Second World War. So then food would have been quite scarce. Before that, there would have been rationing. And then later on, it would have improved a bit. But especially on the farms seemed to be the places that these children loved to go and loved to eat. And they always had lots of amazing farm food. So I thought it's just interesting to look at what they ate and what they considered healthy in the context of kids who got a lot of exercise and sunshine. They were always outside in the fresh air. They were going on picnics. They were cycling. They were swimming in rivers and oceans. And they ate a lot of good stuff, but they really were active. Same with the farmer, the farmer's wife, the shepherds. They were all very active. But it's wonderful to see what they ate, what they enjoyed, what was available. And I find it inspiring, but I think it also helps us see what's healthy and what's good for us. Here's a clip from one of the adventure books. Supper time came. Cold ham, a salad, junket and cream. Just the right kind of meal, said Philip. So junket was kind of like a healthier version of panna cotta. They would take sweetened milk, and perhaps it was flavored with something like strawberries, and then they would curdle it using rennet, similar to when you're making cream cheese or cheese, etc. So it's like a fermented food, but it still tastes amazing. So to have this soft custard-like texture, it's easily digestible. So it was great for a healthy dessert. So this is interesting to me because they still had desserts and they still had full cream milk in their diets and the strawberries, the fruit, but then they made it healthier by fermenting it a little, curdling it with this rennet in the same way as you would with cheese. Then the salads, obviously they used to use things from the gardens more often than not, so there wasn't pesticides. So there were big tomatoes, lettuces, green beans, all those salady things, and then they would have some kind of meat from the farm. So a cold ham. So this wouldn't be from the deli. This would be ham on the bone that had been baked or cooked on the stovetop and then sliced up and used over a few meals, and also recently slaughtered from the farm. And then the other thing that usually appears in these meals is cream, a delicious jug of cream that you can pour over your dessert or over whatever you'd like to. So this would have been skimmed over the milk as the cows were milked freshly in the dairy, and they would drink the milk and they would use the cream. So there's absolutely no problem with using high fat or full fat dairy, using these rich fatty foods, not processed fats or refined fats, but straight from the cow. And they obviously made homemade cheese as well. So the fact that they had so much sunshine and exercise and a good way to de-stress on the farm, even though it was hectic and busy and crazy, it was still outdoors. And I think that balanced out that diet very well. Here's another excerpt. A long, sturdy kitchen table was covered with a snow-white cloth, and on it was set the finest meal the children had ever seen in their lives. It often says that. A great ham sat ready to be carved. A big tongue garnished round with bright green parsley sat by its side. An enormous salad with hard-boiled eggs sprinkled generously all over it was in the middle of the table. 2 cold roast chickens were on the table, with little curly bits of cold bacon set round. The children's eyes nearly fell out of their heads. What a feast! And the scones and cakes, the jams and the pure yellow honey, the jugs of creamy milk. So that sounds amazing. They describe it so well. So the great ham ready to be carved, the tongue, and then herbs like parsley. They seemed quite happy to eat that. Hard boiled eggs on salad. And the roast chickens, again, the meat is cooked on the bone. It's whole. It's got the skin with it. It's got all the good bits that they could eat, not just the chicken breast part. And then the treats, even the treats are freely eaten. Scones would have been made with a flour that was much more coarsely ground than what we're used to, and it wouldn't have had all the nutrients removed. Cakes usually meant fruit cakes. So, again, a healthier flour, lots of good fruit in there, and no icing, no huge amounts of sugar. Homemade jam, pure honey, and then the jugs of milk, freshly milked cows. So all these foods are rich and they're delicious and they're like creamy, amazing stuff. And the children spend the day outside doing chores, running around in the sunshine, swimming, biking, picnicking. And so it balances out the richness of the food. But it's important to note that they weren't afraid of these kind of foods. Farm food is always the best food, in my opinion. Now, they didn't eat huge amounts of bread with their meals. Sometimes they had sandwiches, but it was usually the fruit, the dairy, the meat, and that's what they ate. But their meals were balanced, and there were a whole lot of different options. They ate whole tomatoes, they ate lettuces. They didn't just eat meat, like just chicken breast with pasta. They ate all these different items, plus the dairy, plus the stuff fresh from the garden to make the meal really well balanced. And the cream and the rich dairy would have been so nourishing. What's also interesting is sometimes they have a big glass of creamy milk at bedtime or in their beds. And I often do feel like a glass of milk at bedtime. It really helps me to not feel hungry in the night and to just feel like satisfied and calm at the end of the day. And it's highly nutritious. We always use raw milk for that. And it's not had its cream removed, so it's full cream milk. And it really is so satisfying and nutritious. And I think it's supposed to help you sleep better. That's maybe why they used to have it then. Then another section here says the breakfast table was loaded almost as much as the supper table had been. Jugs of creamy milk stood about the table, warm from the milking. Big bowls of raspberries had appeared. I can smell eggs and bacon, said Jack, and there's cereal with raspberries and cream and ham and tomatoes. And gosh, is that cream cheese for breakfast? How delightful. So that's a huge meal. I know the farmers would work very hard, and so they would need a good meal. Perhaps they go out and do their early morning chores, milk the cows, clean out the chickens, etc., then come in for a good big breakfast. And there would be the dairy, there's the egg and bacon, there's the fruit. And also remember, around this time, some people had refrigerators, but not everybody did. A lot of food was stored in the larder. So the fruit would be kind of freshly picked because it wouldn't last very long. The milk would often be from that day's milking and often warm, not always icy cold. So they enjoyed that warm milk, and it would have the most enzymes possible and all the good stuff because of that recent milking. Not that we can always do that, but we can look for the best kind of milk. Perhaps you can get from a farm. Perhaps you can get from a co-op or a market that has reasonably fresh milk. Raw milk doesn't last more than a couple of days out of the fridge, except if you like curdled milk, which I guess is also very healthy. Things like making kefir from that milk also increase the nutritiousness or the benefits of it. So I find this all just very interesting to see. Also, the children, other than water, they would drink lemonade or ginger beer. And this was often homemade or made in a local little store or restaurant. So it would have been very much healthier than today's ones. They wouldn't have had a huge amount of sugar. The ginger, the lemon would have been fresh lemon. And that's what they used. Instead of soda, they would quench their thirst with bottles of lemonade or ginger beer when they went on picnics or long rides on their bikes. And then for a snack here, it says there was a great bowl of fresh strawberries and a jug half full of cream. So pour some cream, raw cream, over fruit, over fresh raspberries, or it makes for a great snack, even though it's supposedly bad fruit and fatty cream. So we shouldn't be afraid of these things. They're so good for us, and they're the way God made them. And if they're in the context of a healthy, active lifestyle, then they're really amazing. In the last bit I'm going to read, a high tea. There was a fresh ham, glistening pink, a veal and ham pie smothered in green parsley like the ham, yellow butter in glass dishes, a blue jug of thick yellow cream, honey, homemade strawberry jam, hot scones, a large fruit cake as black as a plum pudding inside, egg sandwiches, tea, cocoa, and creamy milk. I'm absolutely determined to live on a farm when I grow up, said Jack, looking approvingly at all the food. So we can't all live on farms, but it's still fascinating to see how they ate and to see what we can do to emulate that. So again, the ham and then the pie. Often they had pies in the larder, and the fact that it was veal and ham, so they ate varieties of meat. And then the parsley again, smothering at the herbs from the garden. The yellow butter, which would be homemade from the fresh cream. And then again, the thick cream, honey harvested locally, the jam that was made on the farm, scones that were recently made, the fruit cake, which had lots of fruit and was dark, probably had molasses in, all the good stuff there, and then egg sandwiches. So they had homemade bread also made on the farm. And when they talk in the books about camping somewhere, they often go to farms nearby to get eggs and cream and milk and homemade bread. And obviously, it would have been sourdough bread because they couldn't buy yeast at the supermarket very often. So they would use sourdough and then cocoa and creamy milk. So that all sounds so delicious to sit down with that kind of meal. I'm sure it would feel a little overwhelming and maybe seem too rich because we're not used to that kind of thing. But it definitely inspires me to do more desserts of maybe fruit with raw cream or baked apple with cinnamon instead of just sugary desserts. And to do fruit and tomatoes and lettuce and those kinds of things, not necessarily in a salad, but even individually without having to cook a lot of vegetables with a meal. And then having the meat on the bone instead of the ground beef and chicken breasts all the time. And to use cheese and to try and make some of these things freshly for ourselves, plus the fermented dairy, the kefir, the fermented yogurt, all of those things with the raw milk, if possible, if that's what you like. So I hope it inspires you just to think a little bit about what you feed your family and not to be so afraid of good foods, so-called fatty foods or fruits that are often demonized, but in fact are really healthy. The way I like to think of it is, how did God make the food, in what form? And therefore, let's keep it as close to that as possible. So again, meat on the bone, or whole potatoes, or whole fruits of any kind, milk, cream cheese, cottage cheese, and then to try and be as active as possible to balance out that good hearty food. Thanks for listening today. Have a great week. I'll see you next time.